Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. My name is Sandra Alfas. I'm the director of the Wolpow Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity here at Western Washington University, and I'm also a professor of German in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages. We are very excited to see so many of you here this afternoon for our presentation. Before Dr. Sue Gunter-Schlesinger, the Vice Provost for Equal Opportunity and Employment Diversity, is going to introduce our speaker, I would like to take a moment and thank the different offices and people who actually made this visit possible. So, as you were able to read on the press release and on some of the posters, this is a co-sponsored event, so thank you very much to the Equal Opportunity Office, to CHSS, which is the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, to the Provost's Office, to us, the Wolpow Institute, university residences, and the Western Libraries. They all helped organize this talk. In particular, I want to thank Clarissa Mansfield and Connie Mallison in the libraries for their help. In Equal Opportunity, I would like to thank Haley Chittick and Linnea Rickman for their help. And last but not least, Sheila Pinnell, who's the new administrative assistant to the Wolpow Institute, and I already would not know what to do without her, so thank you. I also want to take the opportunity to thank our student volunteers, and this year's student volunteer coordinator is Rachel Perkins. Rachel, where are you? Anthropology is very well represented in the Institute, so thank you to all of the anthropology students who are so eagerly helping, as well as German students and history students. I would like to extend a very special welcome to our community, and in particular, we are fortunate to have with us today Mrs. Noemi Bahn, who many of you know, our local Holocaust survivor and educator. Welcome, Noemi. We're so glad to see you. And now it's my privilege to ask Dr. Sue Gunter-Schlesinger to the stage to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sandra. Good afternoon. I need to hear a little livelier comeback on that. Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all very, very much for being here to this really important event today. It is a great pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Mr. Mark Weitzman. But before I do, I'd like to provide a little bit of background on why we're having this program and why we have decided to invite Mr. Weitzman to talk to us today. Mr. Weitzman's visit supports the implementation of the first of 21 recommendations of a report issued last spring from the university's Task Force on Preventing and Responding to Anti-Semitism. This task force was convened by Western's president at the time in response to a series of anti-Semitic incidents that had occurred on campus. The task force's first recommendation was to, quote, develop a working definition of anti-Semitism to guide the rest of the 20 other recommendations and their implementation. So the issue of working definition became very important to us. After the task force completed its work and issued their report, a small work group convened, which included Mark Greenberg, Dean of Libraries, Stephen Garfinkel, Professor of History, and Sandra Alfers from the Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity, and myself. And we continued our efforts together to develop a working definition of anti-Semitism for Western. We researched and then adopted the working definition that Mr. Weitzman developed in his leadership role with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, otherwise known as IRA. A definition that recently was established as the first working definition of anti-Semitism internationally with some formal international status. This definition will serve as a guide for academic and administrative organizations, for faculty, staff, and students at Western in implementing the task force recommendations. The work of the task force and the resulting recommendations on how to prevent and respond to anti-Semitism is a critical part, but just one part, of Western's overall commitment to move forward on all forms of bias, hate, and discrimination. In implementing our first recommendation, we are offering a starting point. By doing this, we are creating a common vocabulary work and discussions that lie ahead, leaving plenty of room for critical and respectful engagement. Our work has been guided by recognizing that there is not one form of prejudice or hate that is more significant or serious than another. All forms of discrimination denigrate human dignity and divide us as a society. As a campus community, we are dedicated to having these sometimes difficult but timely conversations in efforts to make all of our campus community more equitable, inclusive, and welcoming to all. We are so very fortunate to have Mr. Weitzman here with us today. As his tremendous work on developing an internationally ratified working definition of anti-Semitism, one that we can use here, right at Western, will provide context and meaning to the work we do. And so now it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker. I will ask you to hold your comments and any questions you may have until Mr. Weitzman finishes his presentation, and then we'll have ample time for discussion. Mark Weitzman is the Director of Government Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center and is also Chief Representative of the Center to the United Nations in New York. He is a member of the official U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, where he chairs the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial. Not only did he spearhead IRA's recent adoption of the working definition of anti-Semitism, but he also was a lead author of IRA's working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion, also adopted by the 31 member countries that are included in IRA. Mr. Weitzman is a member of the advisory panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And he co-chairs the Working Group on International Affairs of the Global Forum on Anti-Semitism. Currently, he is also a participant in the Program on Religion and Foreign Policy of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he is a board member and former vice president of the Association of Holocaust Organizations and was a member of the advisory board of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy at Yale University. He is also a longtime member of the official Jewish-Catholic Dialogue of New York. Mr. Weitzman is a winner of the 2007 National Jewish Book Award for the best anthology for, and this is a title, Anti-Semitism, the Generic Hatred, Essays in Memory of Simon Wiesenthal, which he co-edited and contributed to, and which has appeared in French, Spanish, and Russian editions. Among his many publications, way too numerous to mention all of them here, is a chapter Mr. Weitzman authored entitled, quote, The Transmigration of Anti-Semitism, Old Myths, New Realities, which appeared in the volume of the book Not Your Father's Anti-Semitism, The Hatred of Jews in the Early 21st Century. A frequent commentator on issues related to anti-Semitism, extremism, and tolerance, Mr. Weitzman has made television appearances with Charlie Rose, Rachel Maddow, Keith Olbermann, and the History Channel, and has contributed to newspapers such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Washington Times, the Jerusalem Post, the Times of Israel, to name just a few. And this is one of the pieces of his background he wanted to make sure you understood. Mr. Weitzman has served as the historical advisor to the Marvel Comics graphic novel X-Men Magneto Testament. Mr. Weitzman has testified in Congress, met with world leaders, including UN Secretary Generals Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, and Antonio Guterres, and has been a featured speaker at 3 UN conferences on anti-Semitism and extremism. He was also one of the Jewish leaders to meet with Popes Benedict and Francis on their visits to the United States. At this time, it gives me great pleasure in asking you to help me give Mr. Mark Weitzman a very warm welcome to Western.
First of all, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the warm welcome. I'm actually surprised that the applause for Magneto did not drown out the applause for myself. I would have ranked it that way personally, but that's your choice. But I really, to the thanks that Sue mentioned and Sandra mentioned, to everybody who invited and worked on this program, I also want to add my personal thanks to both Sue and Sandra and the members of the steering committee who have worked so hard, students, faculty, and administration, in not just putting this program together, but also in creating an atmosphere and environment where I think, which is unique in American universities today, which is proactive and is dealing with an issue before it becomes a crisis and is recognizing the importance of creating and establishing something that really has an effect on the culture of the campus and a long-term effect rather than waiting, as I said, for a crisis to happen. So I applaud all those involved in the effort to do that, as well as the campus at large for engaging in this dialogue. And it's really my pleasure and honor to be here and to be a part of that in any small way that I can contribute. I wanted to begin with a very simple question of why did we work on the definition of anti-Semitism? Why did it take a number of years, 2-3 years, massive political engagement, a massive amount of commitment of time and energy and effort to do something that on the surface we would say, as with any other type of hate, should be rejected at face value? Any manifestation of hatred or prejudice or bigotry to any group of people or any individual is something that we would think would automatically be legitimized and rejected and repudiated. And yet, clearly, we felt that it was worth investing in international effort on a high political level to come up with this working definition. So I'm going to basically take you on a little bit of an historical tour, not too much, it's not a history lecture, don't worry, to begin with, and then go into the creation itself. So I'm going to begin with the synagogue in Wuppertal, Germany. This is a synagogue that was a rebuilt synagogue from a community that dated back to, I think the earliest mention is the late 1590s, so it's almost 600-year-old community. And the synagogue was destroyed by the Nazis in 1938. This is the rebuilt synagogue from the remnants of the Jewish community that came back and reestablished themselves after the Holocaust. Okay? And then there are two slides I put together. The bottom one, you can see 3 Molotov cocktails that were tossed at the synagogue in July 2014 by 3 men. And on top, that's the police investigating and doing the evidence search. So you see it was a clear arson attack. And 3 people were arrested, and they acknowledged what they had done. They confessed. And they said they all came from Middle Eastern background and said that they were doing it in anger at Israel's actions in the Gaza in summer of 2014, spring, summer of 2014. But nonetheless, they hadn't gone to the streets in a protest, whatever. They had firebombed the building with no regard whether people were in it or not in it, etc. So that's the first thing. The second one I'm going to tell you, just describe to you, was a case in Austria in 2015 when a person posted on Facebook phrases praising Adolf Hitler and basically calling for the death of Jews. And that was a case that was brought to the local prosecutor as a case of potential hate speech. In both those cases, the authorities made a ruling. I would suspect, if I asked for a poll from you, and obviously it's skewed a little bit because we're standing here and sitting here on it, but would you judge those to be anti-Semitic, 2 cases? One a case advocating for praise of Hitler and death for Jews, and the other a firebombing with potentially victims inside. I think most people, certainly most people that we know, would say, absolutely, that's crossed the line. We're not talking even about opinions anymore, we're talking about calls for violence or actual violence. And yet, in both cases, authorities, and we're not talking about opinion here, but we're talking about legal authorities, ruled otherwise. In Germany, the lower court ruled that this was a political statement, a protest over policies by a foreign country. And that ruling was upheld last January 2017, by an appeals court. Two levels of courts in Germany claimed or decided that was not anti-Semitic. In Austria, the prosecutor as well said it was just an attempt to draw attention to the conflict in the Middle East, and the statements that called praising Hitler and calling for the death of Jews were also equally not anti-Semitic. Because in both those countries, there are laws on the books about anti-Semitism and about expressing support for Nazis publicly and so on. And yet, both cases, the legal authorities refused to move. This was a tweet from last week from the UK. Drove through Stamford Hill today, could read it with the gaps, not even sure what that means, but I think the streets riddled with full-blown Jews, absolutely vile. Someone complained to Twitter. Twitter's reaction? Not anti-Semitic. It's fine. It's cool. It's okay. So clearly, we see that there's an issue. When mainstream authority groups, whether it's service providers that kind of rule the world these days, or governments, legal authorities, have issues in what we would say are common sense, and the difference between common sense, what our eyes tell us, are clearly anti-Semitism, and yet rule otherwise, we have a situation where there's a lack of understanding of what anti-Semitism is. Because of that, I'm going to go backwards before I bring it up to date. So the first thing I want to say is, for many people today, think of anti-Semitism as connected to what's happening in Israel, or with Israel, or that Israel has done, or something connected to the Middle East. The reality is, anti-Semitism did not begin in 1948 when Israel was created. Anti-Semitism is a long and inglorious history, particularly in Western culture. So if we go back to classical anti-Semitism, we find a couple of varieties. The first predates the beginning of the Christian era and was the Roman and Greek time, and it was based more on the idea of people not buying in, Jews not buying in to the established system and being different, and political revolts and so on. And scholars today basically call that anti-Judaism as distinct from anti-Semitism. So that's just a quick mention about that. But we generally, in many ways, date anti-Semitism itself from the start of the Christian era. And I'm going to give you 4 examples, all related to the word deed, or 4 explanations. The first one, in classical Christian thought, and you can see this in some of the writings of the church fathers, John Chrysostom and others, based on Paul and others, is that Judaism at the time of Christianity, at the time of Jesus, was degenerate. Jews had strayed away from the biblical promises and God's wishes, and had gone in a different legalistic, less spiritual way, and so on, had become this people more interested in the letter of the law than the spirit of the law. These are all classical tropes that you see in this. And as such, because they had degenerated that way, God had reached a point where God had run out of patience, and so had sent a messenger to redeem them. And the Jews, being the people that they were, what did they do to this messenger, identified as Jesus? They had killed him. They had murdered him. The term for murdering God, deicide. So the degenerated people committed the act of deicide. As a result, there were 2 punishments that were going to follow for that. And these are very strong, powerful concepts that will resonate historically. You'll see that in a second. One is that, as a result, they were eternally damned. Murdering the Son of God in this is not a simple, small fact. It has incredibly serious and grave implications. So they were damned, and as part of that, they were condemned to wandering, to lose their homeland, to a diaspora. So the shorthand is the damned people committed deicide, degenerate people committed deicide, were damned, and punished with diaspora, among other things. The exiled Jews for thousands of years. And when you get into later times, as we go through the centuries, this is already over 1,000 years after those events. And here we have a major pope saying that the Jews, by their own guilt, and laying out the same thing that I just told you, laying out in one or two sentences the guilt of the Jews. And it wasn't just obvious. Remember, at this time in medieval Europe, Christianity really was the dominant power. But we think of it in terms of religious power, and sometimes even secular power, ruling over kingdoms or influencing kings, the Crusades, and so on. But we don't realize that the images became even more powerful. So we have the idea of Jews poisoning wells, and you can see over there the image connected to the crucifixion. And as a result of that, and by the way, there are hundreds or thousands of these images, as a result of that, Jews were burned at the stake. But they were plague carriers. This was an added level. Not only had they done those ancient crimes, but these were crimes brought forward, that these people who were living within, they were like termites, burrowing away. They were inside the world. They were not coming from the Middle East. They were not the Muslim warriors that the Crusades engaged with. These were people within the Christian world. We're poisoning the wells. We're destroying from inside. This is one of the earliest conspiracy theories that you could think of. And then we have visual images as well. These are a church window, and you can see in it, there are depictions of the synagogue as broken compared to the upright, standing church. The synagogue, we'll see it up close a little bit more. The synagogue is sort of a drooping, dead bush. The church is flowering. The church is under the sun. The synagogue is under the wan-reflected moon. Multiply these images by thousands of people walking past them every day from the Cathedral of Strasbourg, one of the great cathedrals still around. A portal, an entryway, showed the synagogue blindfolded because the synagogue could no longer see. They had been blind to reject Jesus, and that blindness was carried forward up to that point and later, while standing upright, firm with a strong supporting staff, is the church. And I could continue with showing more of these details, but they ended up creating a picture that permeated the way people looked and viewed Jews. So we're talking about something now, we're beginning to get on to what I'll call structural anti-Semitism, which is the anti-Semitism that in some ways has been the dirty little secret of Western culture. And we fast forward a little bit to Martin Luther. We move away from the Catholic world into the Protestant world. Luther began by reaching out to the Jewish community. He thought he would find support there. And there were some Jews, including one example of a stray Kabbalist, a Jewish mystic, who saw Luther as the forerunner of the Messianic age because he was attacking the church. But when Luther found out and realized that Jews were not converting en masse to become Protestants, he turned on them with a fury. And this is a writing from his book on the Jews and their lies, and you could see, and just look down, I'm not even going to read it, you can read it for yourselves, I don't like reading PowerPoints. But you could see the range of attack, the level of invective, and just think this happened in Germany. It was a few hundred years, and during Luther's time, there were no murderous persecutions of Jews. But multiply these attitudes seeping around and sitting around in what was the dominant religion of the country, and you begin to get a sense of the inhospitable layer that Jews were always dealing with. But it wasn't religion only. Voltaire is known as the father of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was the revolt against religion. It was the rejection of the superstitious church, the opening and flowering of intellectual inquiry, of scientific inquiry, and so on. But for Voltaire, and among others, that group, an attack on the church also meant an attack on the origins of the church. And if there was a link between Judaism, which had been the fount from where the church came from, then Jews and Judaism also came under attack. And in some ways, a more bitter attack than the church itself. And again, just one quote from Voltaire, and any of these could be topics, have been topics of books and seminars and whatever. So we're really just skimming the surface here. If we began, let's say, with religious anti-Semitism, from the church and the Protestant world. We're now going on to a more rational, intellectual anti-Semitism that is not rooted in religion necessarily, but is nonetheless still present. And then in the 19th century, after Darwin and social Darwinism, became the attempt to create a taxonomy of racial science, where people were put in groups according to their supposed origins and physical characteristics. And there were superior groups and inferior groups. And of course, at the bottom, and the root of all evil, for some of these people, were the Jews. So this is the work of one of the founders of racial science, a man who had a direct influence, and there was a chain through him, through another man, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who was actually inspired Hitler directly, who all came in and played on this idea that there were races, and the Aryan race is the most superior, even though they're highly, I don't think you find anyone today who believes in the Aryan race by itself, other than a small band of committed Nazis today, and that Jews were either inferior or were the arch enemy. So that's a further strand. So each one is building on the past, and each one is adding to it. If you weren't religious, but you could be a rational anti-Semite. And if you were a scientist, then you could be a scientific anti-Semite. To the point where, in the late 19th century, a German publicist named Wilhelm Marr coined the term anti-Semitism. It had been used slightly before that, but Marr really was the one who publicized it. Up to that point, it had been anti-Judaism or sort of loose things. And Marr's idea was basically he wanted to create to give a scientific basis to anti-Semitism. He wanted to take it out of the street and into the academy, into the intellectual circles of the time. He wanted to get away from the street rabble. So he glossed it as anti-Semitism to tie into this idea of races and so on, and Semitic races. And by the way, that is why people who generally work in the field do not hyphenate it. Because if you hyphenate it, you give legitimacy to the idea that there is a Semitic race, and you're sort of playing into or along with this whole idea. By unhyphenating it, it basically brings it back to Marr's original point, which was essentially targeting Jews, and you're not really dressing it up with this artificial idea of Semitic, anti-Semitic, or non-Semitic, and so on. So Marr wanted to anchor it in the science of the new race and give the term more respectability. And for Marr, Germans and Jews were locked in a long-standing conflict, which he saw as racial, and Jews were winning, and he was terrified. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. An immigrant group, a foreign group, winning a culture war, so to speak. So he came up with this idea, and he felt that Jewish emancipation, which had been allowed and permitted by German liberalism, these terms are very familiar, aren't they? Had allowed Jews to control German finance and industry and seize control and were weakening Germany from the inside. And since there was a racial quality involved, Jews had shown themselves to be superior and were winning the war. And he had to do something to fight it. Thus, he wanted to anchor it and put it in and create this, and founded the first League of Anti-Semites, which was a political party based on anti-Semitism. And all this was in late 19th century Germany. Odd and interesting and hopefully hopeful note to the end. Marr, by the end of his life, had repented of his views and publicly apologized to the Jewish community. And there's hopefully a lesson in that as well. But anyway, we have him to thank for the political and prevalence of the term anti-Semitism. The next one was, I don't know if I did a slide on that one. No, I didn't do that. We'll leave that up for a second. Was the anti-Semitism that grew out of the works of Marx and other early socialists and communists that saw Jews as interested only in capital, their God as only being God of money, and were tools of the exploiters and the capitalists to oppress the working class, and created a framework of another kind of anti-Semitism as well. So again, by the way, you're seeing that anti-Semitism is on the right and the left, in the scientific, in the halls of science, and in the street. And in political terms as well, I alluded to this earlier, the late 19th century also saw what we call the conspiracy school of anti-Semitism, which was the birth of the book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which alleged it was a forgery by the Tsarist secret police, the Russian secret police, with some Ukrainian assistance, but it alleged that a small group of Jewish elders had gotten together and were basically wanted to control the world. And they were pulling the strings behind everyone. This is the granddaddy of conspiracy theories. And it's still functional today. To the point where the charter of Hamas, the radical Islamist organization, in section 32 of its charter, quoted the protocols as showing the proof that Jews are behind the creation of everything that's made with the world, including the creation of the State of Israel. But they literally quoted the protocols in today's world, even though they've been totally discredited. This was also Hitler's major inspiration. And it is a book. What can I tell you about the protocols? I did a book with friends sort of refuting it. So I'll give you one quick example of just where their minds were cut. Late 19th century. At that time, European capitals were first getting their first subways in, and there was a lot of digging underground and so on, and tunnels being built. The protocols alleged, among other things, that one of the methods of Jewish control was that in each of these capitals, Paris and London and Moscow, etc., the great cities of Europe, there was dynamite stored at the command of the Jewish elders, who were then telling the rulers of Europe that if you don't follow us, we will blow up the tunnel and destroy your cities. Now, you may have thought that was credible, let's say, in 1901. But in the century, over a century that's passed, there's been a huge amount of dynamiting and blowing up of European cities. Not once has it been done by Jews. That's how credible the protocols were at that time. But they found a willing listener, the creator of American industry, Henry Ford, who imported them to the U.S. And Ford, who was a fan of Hitler, his family, again, has repudiated and moved far away from it. I don't want anyone walking out of here and going to have to boycott Ford products today. But he was the man responsible for introducing the protocols to the New World, as it was put, and did a whole series in his newspaper on them. So that brings us a little bit to the point where these strands all come together and create the environment that allowed for the Holocaust, which was, I will just sum it up very quickly, the greatest example of industrial genocide. Not the only example of genocide, and it's still going on, but the greatest example of industrialized genocide that the world had seen up to that point, and probably includes now, and was certainly something that radically challenged the assumptions that Western culture was built on. I'll leave it like that. But this is a book that was published by one of the Nazi publishing houses that was a children's book called The Poison Mushroom. And I took some slides from that to show you how the themes that we talked about in the past couple of minutes reappear as Nazi themes. Not all of them, but most of them. So first one, you see the quote, I translated it up as a translation of it up there, and it's a picture of Jesus on the cross. And the Nazis were not good. I mean, there were Nazis who were religious, and there was an attempt to create a Nazi form of Christianity called Deutsche Christentum, and there were all sorts of tie-ins and so on. But there was also a lot of anti-religious and anti-Christian feeling and action in the Nazi ideology, and there were persecution as well. But here they used it. They tapped into that vein of religious anti-Semitism to teach children how to be further anti-Semites and legitimize, justify Nazi anti-Semitism. In terms of the anti-intellectual, the rational, the Nazis also burned books. And this was an example of a major book burning. And those are some of the authors that were burned, whose books were burned. Albert Einstein, Freud, Hemingway, who was not Jewish, but no one is perfect. They didn't always apply it very, very carefully. But they didn't like him. Well, there it goes. Kafka. And the last author who no one ever heard of, but you may be more familiar as the writer of Bambi. What Bambi had to do with being, maybe it was too liberal, maybe it's still hard to justify or understand. But nonetheless, the Nazi ideology Bambi was burned along with Kafka and Einstein and so on. The famous German poet Heine, a century before, had prophesized unwittingly and written that where they burn books, next they will burn men. And that was a prophecy that we all know came to pass. Back to the poison mushroom. The science. They went around in classrooms. I've spoken to survivors who experienced this. Noses were measured. Heads were measured to see if they fit into the Aryan definition or none definition. So, of course, bizarrely enough, you had Jews who had perfect Aryan features and non-Jews who didn't fit into it, but nonetheless it was an attempt to legitimize and use science as they saw it, eugenics and other forms of science, to justify anti-Semitism. We find that all over today. People using scientific theories, or quote-unquote scientific theories, to justify racism and hatred. The idea of money. The picture speaks for itself. Jews will do anything for money. That's the only thing they worship. And they control the world. So at the same time, you had the bizarre thing, because the Nazis also invented the term Judeo-Bolshevism, meaning that Jews were behind communism. So in Nazi and in anti-Semitic ideology to today, you find the odd and hard to imagine conjunction that Jews are both capitalists who will do anything for money, and at the same time, they're communists who will do anything to subvert money. But somehow or other, this worldview is able to encompass both. So, that brings us up to today. My point with all this was that after the Holocaust, many of us, and particularly this applies to the United States, thought that anti-Semitism had been destroyed on a certain level. We knew it existed in subterranean currents of extremist groups. You're not too far from Idaho, where Coeur d'Alene, where the Aryan nations used to hang out, and groups like that. But they were numerically very small, and even though they were violent, and we just look at Oklahoma City, which until 9/11 was the greatest example of domestic terrorism that the U.S. had, which was done by a person, McVeigh, with connections to these groups and so on. But nonetheless, we didn't see it as sort of a mainstream problem. Jews had sort of entered into American society. They had candidates running as vice president. They had people in the Supreme Court. They had people in Hollywood and stars in music and industry and literature and so on and so forth. They were the minority success story. As other minorities were held back in many ways, Jews became pointed to as the minority success story. The reality is that it took some events to sort of open our eyes to that. So we go back to the year 2000. I'm going to say that one of the seminal events, some of the speakers is going to come, I think, next month here. The historian Deborah Lipstadt had an epic trial in London with a Holocaust denier named David Irving. Debbie will tell you all about it. She's great. But what it did, it stripped away the veneer from Holocaust denial and exposed it, end result, as another form of anti-Semitism. That question and those questions of Holocaust denial, distortion, and so on were one of the things that led to the creation of this group IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which came about also in the year 2000, actually started in 1998, but the year 2000 at the same time as the Lipstadt trial. And this was partially the result, it was called, of a conference called together by the then Prime Minister of Sweden, Göran Persson, who wanted high-level heads of state, foreign ministers, etc., to come together to discuss anti-Semitism and particularly and the Holocaust. What was his motivations? There were two. One was, I think, no question, idealistic, which Persson had seen a poll in Sweden that showed remarkable ignorance about the Holocaust, and this concerned him a great deal. The second part was practical and political, I think, which was that at that time there was a lot of investigation beginning into the question of looted assets, of property taken from Jews that had found its way to Swiss banks and insurance companies and US, London, and a lot of other countries. And I think Persson had the sense that Sweden may have its own issues with that and wanted to sort of get ahead of the issue. So we called this conference together, and one of the things that was also interesting about this conference and very important was at the same time as countries that had formerly oppressed by communists and under communist rule in what was behind the old Iron Curtain in Europe had just come out, the late 1980s, and so were just coming out, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and entering into, really for the first time in decades, they had been under Nazi occupation, then under communist rule. And they were creating new institutions for themselves, and one of those was looking at their history in an open and unfettered way for the first time. History under both the Nazis and the communists was political. It was not an academic discipline as we look at it today. It was not something open for debate. It was a political tool under a program laid down by the government, and you had to follow that. So, for example, in many of the memorial sites of the Holocaust, under communist rule, you will not find mention that victims were Jews. You will find here lie generic victims of fascism, because the communist program did not want to differentiate between groups, or sometimes the countries that they were, or the message, the audience that was targeted with these messages were audience that composed traditional anti-Semites as well. So there was an erasure of the Jewish, even the Jewish aspect of the Holocaust in many of these countries. There had been no confrontation with any local collaboration. That had been papered over, and other issues. So one of the things that was attempted through this forum in Stockholm in 2000 was the idea that the states, Britain, the United States, and places like that, France, Germany, Austria, that had already developed schools and scholarship dealing with the Holocaust, would be able to use that expertise to help the emerging countries and coming out in terms of their own emerging historiography, and learn how to approach the subject in an open way that had never been allowed before. So that was the impetus to create this group. But then over the past decade or so, and this group 2000, over the past decade or so, we have seen the situation change. And these countries that have now, even though some of them are now, as the Hungary of Viktor Orban infamously declared a couple of years ago, view themselves as illiberal democracies, not liberal democracies. But nonetheless, they have shown they have voting and rule of law to a certain extent and so on. But what we've seen is an upsurge, a radical upsurge of anti-Semitism throughout, particularly beginning in Europe over the last decade, in which there were just all sorts of violent attacks on Jews, murders in Copenhagen, in Brussels, in France, political assaults across the continent, mob violence and calls to murder Jews, social media, in the street, and so on, to the point where literally Jewish communities in Europe, which are very small and have still not recovered from the Holocaust and very often feel that they have to hide their Jewish identity, began to look at immigration and leaving Europe behind as the answer. A very recent poll, just a couple of weeks ago, showed that 1 out of 3 Jews in the United Kingdom has considered immigration. And that's the United Kingdom, which is supposedly our sister democracy. In France, there's been an exodus of Jews, which has the largest Jewish population outside of Israel and the United States. And it reached a point where last year, or 2 years ago, the first vice president of the European Commission, Franz Timmermans, a German diplomat, actually said, and I'm quoting him here, if there's no future for Jews in Europe, there's no future for Europe. And what Timmermans meant is that, especially after the Holocaust, if Europe can't find a way to accommodate a small Jewish population, then it meant the structures of civil society, of liberal democracy, of human rights, have all failed. And that's where anti-Semitism has become a bellwether for where we are as our own societies. So that was Europe. And in many ways, as I said earlier, for the United States and people in the US, it was very comfortable and easy to say, it's Europe. That's where the Holocaust happened. There's a history of anti-Semitism there. Comparable, their anti-Semitism was the first line of hatred. We could say that in the United States, racism against people of color, against Native Americans was the first line, etc. But so we point fingers and we say, that's their problem. Well, what do we expect? But it's not an American problem. It's not an American issue. I think over the last year and a half, those illusions have been stripped from us. And I'm not going to get into tremendous detail about it. I'm just going to give you two, I think, very telling things. One is can be summed up in one word, Charlottesville. You all saw that on TV. And you saw that the chants, even though it was supposedly something to support this idealized view of the South and Confederate statues and so on and so forth, somehow or other it got to, Jews will not replace us. It got to blood and soil, which was a Nazi slogan. It was a Nazi program. It was the idea that the land had to be stripped of Jews and given to Germans for their own purposes, Lebensraum, living room, and so on. That's where that term came from. It's directly linked to Nazi ideology. And all that was encompassed, as we saw in Charlottesville, and the reactions and lack of reactions to Charlottesville. And then we also have the fact that statistically, surveys have shown that in the last third of 2016 and 2017, anti-Semitism has surged. 1/3 higher at the last part of 2016 and 86% more in the first part of 2017. And I can give you more statistics. I'm not going to bother with more statistics, but that's what. And so you can ask again. So what does that mean, and how do we define anti-Semitism? And that's where we began to go back to our work, because in working with Ira and chairing this committee, we began working on a definition of Holocaust denial and distortion. Holocaust denial, as I mentioned earlier, was an easy one. That's the David Irving type that Holocaust never happened, and it's usually done either by neo-Nazis or the government of Iran and people like that. None of whom have any political or any kind of civil legitimacy in our minds. But distortion on the Holocaust is quite different and much more dangerous. Distortion, for example, can be a country like Hungary that is supposedly dealing with the Holocaust but proposing a statue for a man who was a Nazi collaborator, a politician, a historian and a politician during World War II, who helped propose the Hungarian version of the Nuremberg laws, which stripped Hungarian Jews of their rights and citizenship. And yet, it was a recent proposal over the last couple of years by the government to create a statue and a memorial for this man. That effort was stopped, by the way. But it's just one instance. Poland. Polish government has a law that they've used, and now a stronger version on the books that has possibly been stalled, that basically says that anybody who shames Poland's national name and history, particularly in relation to World War II, by alleging that Poles were responsible for murdering Jews, is liable to 3 years imprisonment. You can go through survivor testimonies I've done, and you can find many places where the survivor says, and worse than the Germans were the fill in the blank, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, whatever, including Poles. And we can understand that because those were their neighbors. Those were the people that they grew up with, that they played sports with, that they went to school with, that they went to movies with, that they danced with, that they went to shops with, that they went to school with, that ate in each other's homes. And when they turn on you, the sense of betrayal is much stronger. And there were, of course, places where the Nazis never even came, where the local population took care of the work themselves. But if you say that, and even if you say that in the U.S., Polish law would say, this proposed law, that you're a criminal and possibly subject to 3 years imprisonment. So that's the distortion element. They're not denying that it happened. They're just saying you can't name us with it. And again, we had it in the first statement from the White House. Last January 27th, the International Day of Holocaust Remembrance connected to the liberation of Auschwitz, the day of the liberation of Auschwitz, when the White House statement on the Holocaust omitted the word Jews. It went back to this generic thing that I talked about earlier. And there was some pushback on both sides, and then later the president spent a long time at the Holocaust Museum and so on, so I'm not putting that in the same category. But nonetheless, whether inadvertent or advertent, it was a form of distortion. So you have those kind of things that are going on, and we wanted to get that in. And we did, but it took 5 years of negotiation before we got 30 countries to sign on board for it. Because the way the process works, one country can block it. It's consensus-based, meaning every country has to join on. But as we're working on it, we realized that there were all these issues where we're talking about a word, anti-Semitism, let's say, and we had people who are coming from 30 different countries, over 30 different countries, from different professions, historians and educators and museums and memorial people, and civil society, NGOs and so on, and diplomats who were rotated in and out every couple of years and had no background on the subject whatsoever. And we're asking them to take action on something, and they're asking us, what is it that we're taking action on? And we had to give them a concrete definition, or else we weren't going to get anyplace. And that was the spark, to accomplish anything on this. And as you saw, defining anti-Semitism, there are 4 or 5 strands that I gave you right there to begin with. We could probably spin off more if we wanted to get more intense and deeper onto it. But it's an elastic definition, because anti-Semitism, and this is one of the things about it, it morphs, it mutates, it changes over the generations. It grows in different seed form. And so we had to find something that would encompass all of that. And finally, we took the definition that had been existing before, that had been proposed by an international body, but never really accepted by any official, with any kind of official status. And we worked on it, made some minor revisions and so on, and we presented it, and it took 2-3 years or so of negotiation before finally, in May of 2016, it was accepted at the plenary session of the IRA in Bucharest, Romania. And that was an extraordinary event, because honestly, I thought it would take longer. But I think that people felt that the situation demanded urgency. And we couldn't go back and spend another 5-6 years and starting from scratch. And they understood that. And that in itself was fascinating. So it came through a committee that I chaired, this Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial. And we had experts and diplomats working on it together, took suggestions. And it's the result, really, of deliberations of people from over 30 countries, from all these professions, different professions. And by the way, one of the things that I found most heartening is that most of the members of IHRA, are not Jews. And they recognize that this is not a Jewish issue. Obviously, the impact is felt by Jews. But it's an issue for the society, wherever the society is, because it reflects on the standards and beliefs and treatment of how we treat any group, minority, individual, and so on. And so I view this definition as opening the door to more work on dealing with these issues on a larger scale, not just focusing only. And we call it, it's a non-binding definition, legally non-binding. It doesn't have legal power. IRA does not have any kind of enforcement authority. It has a political and moral dimension to it, a leadership dimension, an educational dimension. And that's how the definition is meant to work. So when they're the examples that I gave earlier at the beginning of speech, posts online, or actions, people can look at something and say, yeah, that is anti-Semitic. And now I have something to base that on. It's not, there's a famous, probably all heard of the Supreme Court Justice, I think it was White, who was asked to define pornography and said, I can't define it, but I recognize it when I see it. That's a great anecdote, and it can apply to a lot of things, but in today's world, it can't apply to this kind of issue. Because the implications are too steep, too strong. So we had to begin as just a beginning step of grappling with the issue, of creating some form of clarity and some form of focus and framework of what we're talking about when we're talking about anti-Semitism. And I think that we reached it with this definition. And I know that it's found an audience, in some ways, larger than I thought. Because since it's been adopted, it's basically been just a year over its adoption. A series of countries, United Kingdom, Israel, Scotland, Germany, Romania, Austria, and Bulgaria, as well as the City of London, have all formally adopted it. That means that they saw the need for it. That's really, if you talk about international politics and diplomacy itself, that usually moves at a snail's pace. That's an extraordinary fast pace for something to get rooted in. And I know of at least 3 or 4 other countries that have it on their minds. We tried to get it through another international organization called the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's probably behind the UN. It's maybe the second most important international body dealing with Western European and so on issues. US, Canada are all members of it. And I guess the thing that you may know of it, every time that you hear of election monitors, people going out to see if elections are fair and so on, are sent throughout Europe in particular, they come from the OSCE. And it has 2 dimensions. One deals with security issues, and it grew out of the Reagan-era arms negotiations with the Soviet Union at that time. And the other deals with human dimension, which includes anti-Semitism, hatred, Islamophobia, and issues like that. So we try to get it through OSCE, which also operates by consensus. 57 countries, including a series of Muslim countries, Turkey, some of the stands, Kazakhstan, and so on. 56 countries last year all signed off on it. 1 country blocked it. It shouldn't surprise you when I say it was Putin's Russia. They blocked it, which also was kind of reassuring to know that we're on the right track, because if they're blocking it, then I feel pretty good about that. But we went back to it, and we tried thinking about revisiting it this year. And I was just in Warsaw at a meeting of this group, and we had a private meeting with a number of the countries involved, including the Russian ambassador, and we talked about issues and so on. And what heartened me the most out of this was there have been some people who claimed that, oh, you're singling out Jews and it ignores other people. And one of the things that I've said and I've offered to the groups involved was, no, if we get it through, then it means that there's room then for the next definitions to come through, Islamophobia or anti-LGBTQ or whatever else is necessary. And I was really heartened by the fact that the Vatican representative was there and endorsed it. So the Vatican stands for it. The Vatican, which is very sensitive, as it should be, to the rights of Christians, and there is persecution against Christians in parts of the world, saw this, though, as a willing, necessary first step. And I think that that sends a powerful message that while it speaks microly in terms of directly to one particular group and one particular issue, it has a macro application that is positive and necessary for today's world. So I'm going to conclude by saying that I hope, well, one other thing. Last June, the European Parliament also endorsed it or called for all member nations to adopt it formally and to appoint a national coordinator to deal with issues related to anti-Semitism. And I think, again, it's a powerful, the definition has found a necessary space because it's needed, because people think it's practical and it's useful. It's not academic, it's not legal. It's a working tool. But that means that it's where you begin. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so heartened by the efforts on this campus. Because instead of waiting for a situation to escalate, and waiting for a crisis, and waiting for a Charlottesville or Richard Spencer showing up at the University of Florida last week and creating a massive controversy down there, instead of waiting for a wave of incidents, the university, growing out of the work of the combined student, faculty, and administration committee, has come up with a program beginning with the definition. But that's a first step. But I think that if it's adopted and moved forward, this becomes the first university in the U.S. to do that. It sets a statement, a tone, a model for others to follow of engaged dialogue and education, and of public education in the best sense of the word. It shows what can be done in a time when there's a lot of discouraging news. It would be really nice to have the encouraging news of a community that comes together, that listens to the victims, that acknowledges that a bigotry that too often we felt we didn't want to acknowledge, for whatever reason, has been isolated and ignored for far too long, is recognized, is called out for what it is, and creates and charts a path forward that I think and I hope others will follow. So I commend you for doing that. I thank you for coming and listening to me. I hope that I can answer any questions or whatever comes up next. And I really look forward to the next steps that you as a community and as leaders in this effort will take moving forward. Thank you.